Chapter 3 begins with a very interesting question from Arjuna. He asks, "O Krishna, you have said that knowledge is greater than action. Why then do you ask me to wage this terrible war? Your advice seems inconsistent. Give me one path to follow to the supreme good." In chapter 3, Arjuna tells Krishna that he is confused by some of his teachings. He calls them contradictory. Why does he say this? Well, on the one hand, it seems like Krishna is telling Arjuna that all of his problems stem from getting caught up in the affairs of the world. He tells Arjuna to avoid getting attached to sense gratification, whether pleasurable or painful, to become equally disposed to pain and pleasure, and so on. On the other hand, he's also pushing Arjuna to go back into the world, to fulfill his duty as a warrior in this great battle that's about to take place. So, is that a contradiction? It can certainly seem so. After all, if it is action itself, or karma, which keeps us bound to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, to the same ingrained habits that get us the same results time and again, why is it that Krishna recommends Arjuna to seemingly go back into the thick of it? Why doesn't he suggest, for example, that Arjuna go off to a nice quiet place where he can devote all his time and attention to spiritual practices like meditation? If the goal is liberation from the cycle of rebirth, liberation from all the suffering in the world, then wouldn't renouncing the world and renouncing activities, all activities, presumably, wouldn't that be like the logical conclusion to this discourse? In other words, why shouldn't Arjuna renounce the world when it is the world which he's ultimately trying to overcome, to be liberated from as a spiritual aspirant? This is a question that came up for me at some point after I made my own foray into spiritual teachings, tried to start walking a spiritual path, or tried to recommit myself to walking a spiritual path, I guess would be more accurate. And it's a common question, I think. And basically what it comes down to is, why shouldn't I take these teachings, whatever they might be? It doesn't have to be Hinduism, it could be Christianity. Quite honestly, it doesn't even have to be a religion. It could be a diet, or some other philosophy. Basically, the question is, why shouldn't I take this path, whatever it is, to its so-called logical conclusion? For example, if I know and accept that karma is what keeps me bound to the cycle of birth, death, rebirth, all the suffering that comes with it, why shouldn't I endeavor to rid myself of this karma? To find the most austere, most exacting means possible to rid myself of karma. In other words, to take up the so-called renunciate path. Renounce all worldly desires, not pursue any kind of material wealth, abstain from sex, avoid certain music, books, shows, programs, and focus entirely on spirituality, on increasing my spiritual connection. In other words, why should I continue to live in the world when I could simply retreat to some solitary place, devote all my attention and all my energy to more properly spiritual activities? Interestingly, it was actually this question which directly led to my first reading of the Bhagavad Gita. I distinctly remember Googling the phrase, what was it? I Googled the phrase, how to follow the renunciate path. I'm not even really sure what I meant by that, but I heard a teacher talk about it, and it seemed very attractive. And I thought, I must do that. That's what I'm after. That's the goal. That's the most efficient, logical way to do it, to renounce. All this stuff in the world is what causes all the suffering. So why don't I just renounce it, and go and live like a monk or something? Why shouldn't I do that? Well, a couple of things changed. Obviously, I'm not a monk. One of the reasons is because I actually met someone who was training to become a monk, and they kind of let me know that I didn't exactly have the right ideas about the life that they were endeavoring to live. And the other thing that happened was I read the Gita. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna he doesn't discourage anyone from following the renunciate path, from going off into seclusion. But Arjuna in particular, he doesn't seem to suggest that as the ideal path for him, which is another kind of undercurrent in this chapter, the idea that everyone has a path that is best suited for them. Very lovely idea. One of my favorite themes in the Gita, this idea that everyone's got a path that they're kind of predisposed to or best suited for. And, it's kind of, it's meant to encourage, people, don't be so quick to abandon something that is, working for you just because you might hit a roadblock now and then. So it's interesting that Krishna is trying to push Arjuna back into the world, the world that I wanted to retreat from. But he's not just pushing Arjuna into the battle and into the world just for the sake of fulfilling his warrior duties because, I don't know, Krishna just likes watching great battles unfold for his entertainment. Not really. That's not it. There's something more going on here, isn't there? No, he's telling Arjuna to go and perform his duties, but in a particular way and with a particular mindset. And that's what makes this such an interesting discourse, because it's very dialectical. Arjuna is, and this is, I think, why I love Arjuna so much, is because I can relate to that very binary way of thinking. It's either this or that. And Krishna comes along and is like, no, actually, there's a third option, and I'm going to tell you all about it. So he's trying to show Arjuna there's a third way, something that cuts between action and inaction, something that cuts between attachment and detachment. And this path that Krishna recommends to Arjuna, through which one's duty actually becomes their path to liberation, is the essence of karma yoga. I think the poignancy of Arjuna's question, which opens this chapter, can best be appreciated if we have some understanding of karma, very basic but important concept in Hinduism. Karma basically means action. So sometimes we hear people use the phrase, oh, I have good karma, or I got bad karma. In a way, that's more or less getting at it, but there's an important aspect that's being missed when we say that, because we're implying that it's good to get good karma, or that getting more good karma is something we should be working for. That's not exactly the way that it's treated in the Gita. See, there's a reason karma just means action. It doesn't mean good action or bad action. And that's because all action has consequences. And sometimes those consequences are pleasant, and sometimes they're painful. But ultimately, they're all transitory. So if I experience a pleasant consequence as a result of some action I perform, that's great for the time being, until I run out of whatever it is, or it stops being pleasurable. Having 1 donut, that's pleasurable. Having 10 donuts, not so pleasurable. So ultimately, all kind of ends up causing suffering. Of course, all experiences, whether painful or pleasurable, are transitory, not permanent. See, that's kind of the disappointing part, isn't it? Because when I get pleasant consequences because of actions I do. I like that. I want to kind of keep those. I don't really like the unpleasant consequences. So maybe there's a spiritual system where I can get more good consequences that are pleasurable, and just the painful ones, I'll just get rid of those. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. And I mean, really, nothing works that way, because if we try to get rid of one side of the emotional spectrum, what usually happens for those of us who may have tried that through one means or another? Well, you end up getting rid of the other side of the spectrum. If you try to just get rid of the unpleasant feelings, well, what usually happens is we also lose the ability to feel pleasure, and vice versa. But that's okay, because there's a better way. This is what the Gita is pointing to pretty much at all times, is we think there's option A or option B, and the Gita is like, no, there's actually this third way that you haven't considered yet. And from one lifetime to the next, even from one day to the next, we see this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth taking place. It could be a thought. There's the birth. I have a thought. I think I'll have a donut. And then there's the death part, which comes after I've had 10 donuts and I'm not feeling so well. And then I probably feel sick for a while, maybe for a week, maybe a day. But eventually I'll forget about that sick feeling I had, and I'll think, well, this time I'll really just have one. I won't have 10. Or I'll think, well, maybe that was just a bad batch of donuts. It won't happen this time. And there's that rebirth, and we're off to the races again. I also like to think of resentment and anger in terms of, the reincarnational model. I think is very helpful. Maybe someone does something to us that's very hurtful. We get angry. There's the birth. There's the birth of that feeling. Maybe we stew about it for a few hours or a whole day, maybe. But then, eventually we forget until we have to go see them at work the next day, perhaps. And those feelings, they're reborn. Or it could be something that happened years ago. Maybe we're angry. Somebody hurt us years ago, and something we see in the world reminds us of it, and all those old feelings come back as if they had never left. So how do we get out of that cycle? Do we avoid people? If people hurt us, maybe we should just not be around people. People are the problem. Let's avoid everybody. Maybe food is the problem. Well, can't not eat. How's that going to work? So is there no solution? I mean, perhaps we're starting to see why Arjuna feels like Krishna is giving him a contradiction. Maybe we're starting to appreciate Arjuna's confusion a little bit. If karma, actions and their consequences bind us to the world, keep us stuck in a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, then in order to escape this cycle and all the suffering that comes with it, seems like we've got to do something about this karma stuff. We've got to get rid of it somehow. Maybe then we'll be free. Is that correct? I mean, if karma is action, and actions lead to consequences, which, while in the immediate might be pleasurable or painful, they all ultimately just create more suffering. They create more desire. Whether it's desire for more pleasure or desire to avoid pain, desire itself is the source of suffering, which I'm distinguishing between pain. Pain and suffering we have to understand as being different, insofar as suffering can come from pleasure as well, as we've seen. So can we avoid karma? Can we avoid actions? Can we do nothing? Is that correct? Is it even possible? This is what Sri Krishna has to say about that. In verses 4 and 5 of chapter 3, Krishna says, "One who shirks action does not attain freedom. No one can gain perfection by abstaining from work. Indeed, there is no one who rests for even an instant. All creatures are driven to action by their own nature." So it's impossible to literally not do anything. I mean, even if we sit down and resolve to do nothing, even for a minute, just for 60 seconds, I'm going to sit here and do nothing. For that whole minute, I'm doing many things. For one thing, I'm sitting. That's something. I'm also probably thinking a lot. I'm probably thinking the whole time, okay, remember, don't do anything. Remember, if you think about doing something, don't do it. But that whole time, I'm doing something. When you try to do nothing, that's something. And we haven't even talked about all the involuntary stuff that's going on, like my heart beating, breathing. So what is Arjuna supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? Let's listen very carefully to what Sri Krishna says in these next two verses. These are verses 9 and 34. And there's two key words in each of these verses that I'll talk about after I read them. So in verse 9, Krishna says, "Selfish action imprisons the world. Act selflessly without any thought of personal profit." And in verse 34, "The senses have been conditioned by attraction to the pleasant and aversion to the unpleasant. Do not be ruled by them. They are obstacles in your path." So in verse 9, Krishna says it is selfish action that imprisons the world. Selfish action is what binds us. Not action altogether, but selfish. And what does he mean by selfish? Well, last time we talked about the big S self, the Atman, the eternal self, and the little s self, like the ego would be the corollary to that. So that little s self is what we're talking about when we are talking about selfish action. In other words, action that we are doing because we want to get something out of it, or we want to avoid something we don't like out of it. In other words, it's the attachment to the reward, to the result, the fixation on the results of action that binds us, not necessarily the action in and of itself. So the example I like to use for myself is school. There was a long time where I had very poor discipline in terms of getting homework in on time, getting it, done properly and completely. A very hard time focusing in school. And as I got older and started college, I needed to really, buckle down and get some self-discipline, which I did. And that's enabled me to, continue my education and benefit from it. But after a few years being in school, I started to have people telling me that I seemed to have gone from one extreme to the other. From the extreme of being kind of lazy, kind of, apathetic, to being very stressed out, very hyper-focused, unable to take my attention away from an assignment, if I was really, really focusing on it. And neither of those is really healthy. But we can understand the temptation to think that being super focused on getting work done, very well and maybe trying to get it done perfectly, maybe we know that that's not healthy and it's probably causing a lot of stress. But it's hard to turn that off because there's this fear of like, well, I don't want to go back to the way I was before, where I wasn't getting things done on time, wasn't doing them properly. And underneath all that is there's this assumption that those are the only two options, either lazy and not getting work done, or stressed out and angry and frustrated, but productive. So the question becomes, is it possible to be productive without driving myself crazy? And I've come to find that yes, it is possible. And the Gita has been a big part of that, actually, of opening my eyes up to the possibility that, you can do a good job without, driving yourself nuts, or beating yourself up if it's not perfect. Maybe this is a good time to talk about another theme of this chapter, which is something called the Three Gunas. And in Hinduism, the Three Gunas are three elements of matter, or three qualities of matter. Everything has them. People have them, animals have them. Everything has these three qualities. And these three qualities are tamas, which is kind of laid back, relaxed, or slothful, sluggish. Then there's the rajas, which is energy, action, getting stuff done. And then there's sattva, which is this third category. This is the ideal state, the ideal, it's spiritual. Sattva could be a state you get in through meditation, for example. But even though sattva is like the ideal state, it's not a canceling out of the other two. In fact, it contains the other two, or synthesizes them, I suppose. Sattva is kind of like, well, in the case of school, would be fully engaged with an assignment, focused on it, doing the best I can, but not going to the extreme of getting stressed out if it doesn't come out perfect, going to the extreme of getting angry if I make a mistake, while at the same time not going to the other extreme of not caring if I make a mistake, not putting my best effort in the first place, or not answering all the questions properly, and so on. Sattva is this middle ground, I guess you could say. It's very hard to describe, but we've all experienced it. One of the things that can kind of contribute to that would be meditation, right? So meditation, we can sit down and fall asleep. Maybe we have a little too much tamas in that session of meditation. Or maybe we're sitting down to meditate and our mind is just going a mile a minute. Or maybe we're fidgeting, maybe tapping our fingers on our knees or something, annoying all the other people in the meditation hall. Maybe we have a little too much, we're too rajasic that day. Sattvic would be sitting still, quiet. Mind can be racing, but we're not paying as much attention to it, kind of letting it be, do what it needs to do. I think the important part is when we're sitting down in meditation, we're not focused on whether or not we have a quote-unquote good session. That's a very bad start to a meditation session, to sit down and say, I'm going to have a great meditation session. I'm going to out-meditate everybody else in the room. That's not going to be good. It's not going to be a good session. That's what he means when he says, don't be ruled by you're a human being. You're incarnated as a human being. That's just what's going on. It is what it is. There's only so much we can do about that. As human beings, we're going to be disposed towards pleasurable things, and we're going to be averse to unpleasurable things, painful things. We want to get more stuff that feels good and avoid stuff that feels bad. That's just the way we are. I mean, it's the way all animals are. There's not much we can do about that. But what we can do, Krishna says, is we can work to not be ruled by those things. So in other words, it can be possible to see the 10 donuts in front of me and say, I would really like to eat those, but I am going to not eat all 10 of those. I have a choice, and that's where things like meditation come in handy. That's why they call it a practice, because we're practicing for those moments out in the world, where we can see a desire rise up or a thought rise up and just let it go. Just let it pass. Let it do its thing, do what it needs to do, and it moves on. That's the interesting thing about working on, bad habits and addictions and things like that, is we don't realize like how giving in each time is only prolonging, the attachment to whatever the object is that we're attached to. But just a little bit of application, for just even a moment, can have huge, huge benefits. It becomes so much easier the next time I go into the coffee shop and I see the 10 donuts. And I remember, yeah, yesterday I really wanted to eat all 10 of those and I didn't. And I survived. Maybe I can do that again today. As Krishna says, even a little bit of this practice, as he said in the last chapter, that's probably my favorite line in the whole book. Even a little of this practice can save us from the greatest fear. Very encouraging. The last verse I want to read is verse 35. It is better to strive in one's own dharma than to succeed in the dharma of another. Nothing is ever lost in following one's own dharma, but competition in another's dharma breeds fear and insecurity. This was one of those lines that the first time I read this book, hit me right in the forehead. It was exactly the kind of thing I needed to hear, especially since my introduction to the Gita had come from a, real curiosity, real interest in, taking up this renunciate path, which maybe I didn't really understand so much, but it seemed like the right thing. It seemed like I keep using the phrase logical conclusion, and I'm using that very deliberately because that's part of the problem. So a lot of times we're only thinking with our logical, rational mind, and we forget about the heart. We forget about the love and the emotional side of things. And Krishna, unites both of those. Earlier I mentioned that I had a friend who was training to become a monk. Specifically, he was in what is known as discernment, which is a 2-year period before you are allowed to enter the friarhood in Catholicism. So the Franciscan order. And this guy was a few years younger than me, and I was fascinated that someone would make that kind of commitment. And so I really had to pick his brain. And I remember talking to him about it, and he told me something I'll never forget. 2 things. First was his definition of a monk, which I still use today. And he said, a monk is someone who falls in love with God. I think that's just so beautiful. The second thing he said is that the reason people go into that kind of a life, the renunciate life or the monastic life, is not to get away from the world. It's to get closer to God or the divine or whatever it might be. And that, I had to admit, was what was kind of the misconnect for me. I definitely had a sincere desire to increase my spiritual connection to, what I believe in. But I also had a lot of pain and a lot of hurt that I attributed to people and things in the world. And I really wanted to avoid feeling those emotions like anybody else would. But I was going about it the wrong way. And when I read the Gita, I realized there was a third option. Move about in the world and yet not be ruled by, the emotions that come up and the thoughts and desires, but to the best of one's ability. This is not the kind of thing where if you make a mistake, it's all over. We're all going to make mistakes. That's part of it. The introduction of karma as a concept, puts a new spin on that, actually, because all of a sudden all the mistakes we make, first of all, we're realizing, hey, I've been making these mistakes for a long time, lifetimes, in fact. And it also puts a new spin on it, at this idea of it being a mistake. Because that's one way to look at it, but another way to look at it is, hey, this is a lesson. This is an opportunity to change. One way of looking at it is to beat ourselves up and get all, upset and anxious, like, oh, I'm not doing very good, I'm not being a good whatever. But another way to look at it, a much more productive way, is to think, well, hey, isn't it great that I noticed this, that I'm doing this now? Maybe I can try and do better next time. I always feel very encouraged when I read the Gita. I don't feel judged or, it's weird. When I read the Gita, I actually realize that most of the judging that I experience is coming from right up here. It's coming from me. And when I read the Gita, all that stuff just melts away. Because, it's just a man hanging out with a god. I mean, what more do you want? Again, as always, I want to express my deepest gratitude to anyone who finds this helpful. These Friday night reflections that I've been doing in this book have certainly been helping me. They've been definitely helping me get reconnected with my own faith. And I'm just very grateful, for the opportunity to share a little bit of this wisdom with others from the Gita. So, thank you, and see you next week.